Thank you for joining us for this broadcast. We hope you enjoy the program as much as we enjoy presenting it.
Welcome everybody to Mentor Live, the Wednesday of the month. It's that time. And I'm NAFI Board President Rick Todd. Today we are graced with the presence of someone that's had many awards. Among some of these are he's a Flight Instructor Hall of Fame. He's been an instructor since 1988, an Air Force veteran. He's the executive director of the ABS Air Safety Foundation, authored 3 books, and most recently been appointed to the NAFI Board of Directors. Today, Tom Turner joins us in What Should We Talk About Engines? What should we be teaching about engines? Very important point, and it's something that we overlook sometimes as instructors. I know there's a number of instructors that are A&Ps out there, so that always helps you. But for those of us like myself that are not, this should offer a couple pointers for us. So Tom, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks a lot, Rick. I appreciate it. Thanks to everybody for listening in live and in the archived broadcasts. As flight instructors, we have a responsibility to teach pilots pretty much everything they need to know to operate their aircraft. Sometimes it's difficult to include some of the aircraft-specific engine operation techniques and procedures, but it's something that we're responsible for teaching as well. So we've got a lot of ground to cover tonight. Let's go ahead and get started with what we should be teaching about engines. In this webinar, we'll review the reasons why flight instructors need to teach students on all levels about engines and engine management. Specifically, we'll cover what engines need to run and how to get what they need, leaning for takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, and arrival, including high-density altitude conditions, using carburetor heat, including the unusual initial results of carburetor heat use, and how to properly respond to engine roughness, partial power loss, and total engine failure in flight. As you view this course, you may type questions for the speaker. We'll pause to address questions at several points in the program. Any questions we can't get to during the event, we'll capture, and I'll try to answer in the NAFI website members forum within a week of tonight's program. We'll cover all of these concepts from the standpoint of teaching about engines. Remember that the cockpit makes a bad classroom, especially when teaching advanced concepts like engine operation. You'll need to devote time on the ground to explain these concepts and answer your students' questions before you put it into practice in the airplane. Teach on the ground and then practice in the airplane. Why do flight instructors need to teach about engines? First, in order to get desired performance in any aircraft, excuse me, first, in order to get a desired performance in any aircraft, your student needs to know how to manage the engine. Second, power loss and engine failures don't wait for the pilot to become experienced. Your student needs to be ready for engine emergencies on his or her first solo flight, just in case. Third, you will probably be training and providing flight reviews in high-performance airplanes that require more demanding engine management skills. And fourth, someday one of your students is going to come to you and say he or she has bought a Cirrus or a Bonanza or a Mooney and is asking you to provide their transition training. Most of the things we'll discuss tonight are not usually taught during pilot certificate and ratings training. But if flight instructors don't teach our students about engines, who will? An airplane engine, or any engine for that matter, needs 3 things in order to develop power: fuel, air, and a source of spark or ignition. Further, to get desired levels of power and performance, the fuel and the air needs to be delivered in the right proportions. And the ignition, which is why the FAA is, excuse me, need to back up there. In the, sorry, I lost my place there. Further, to get desired levels of power and performance, the fuel and the air needs to be delivered in the right proportions, and the ignition has to occur at the right time. Anything else means less power or wasted fuel at best, and insufficient airplane performance or engine failure at worst. Now, please. Fuel must be of the proper grade or octane. Higher power engines also need additives to protect against detonation or exploding too rapidly when ignited. Tetraethyl lead has been used since the 1930s to provide this protection. Lead is a health hazard, however, which is why the FAA is currently evaluating alternative fuels to replace 100 low lead as the standard piston aircraft fuel. Fuel flows to the engine either by gravity feed or propelled by a fuel pump. Most high-wing airplanes use gravity feed. Fuel flows downward from tanks in the wings toward the engine. As long as the airplane is flown under positive Gs, the fuel will continue to flow. Some high-wing airplanes and most low-wing types have fuel pumps that are driven by the engine's accessory case. As the engine turns, the fuel pump turns, pulling fuel from the tanks and propelling it to the engine. Airplanes that depend on fuel pumps will also have an auxiliary fuel pump, usually powered by an electric motor. They need this to send fuel to the engine for starting when the engine-driven pump is not yet turning. Aux pumps also serve as a backup to run the engine in the case of engine-driven fuel pump failure. They are also useful for cooling an engine during climb and starting fuel-injected engines when the engine is hot. In some airplanes, you'll need to run the auxiliary fuel pump when you switch from one fuel tank to another. In other airplane types, turning on the aux pump in flight can cause the engine to flood and quit. It's all a function of the individual airplane's design. Liquid fuel must be atomized or turned into a very fine spray in order to combine with air for combustion. This is done either by a carburetor or by a fuel injection system. The type of system in the engine has an impact on how the pilot operates the engine in normal, abnormal, and emergency situations. We'll cover these considerations later in this program. Only some light sport aircraft and very light airplanes such as Piper Cubs, Cessna 150s, and 152s have a simple on-off fuel tank switch. If one of these aircraft has multiple fuel tanks, they're designed to feed equally from both tanks when the fuel switch is on. Almost all airplanes, however, have multiple tanks that the pilot must select one at a time. This introduces the need to plan your fuel burn strategy to keep the fuel load balanced and to ensure you do not run a tank completely out of fuel and cause the engine to quit. Some fuel systems will develop a vapor lock if your fuel tank is run dry in flight, and the engine won't restart when you switch to a tank containing fuel. Auxiliary fuel tanks, such as tip tanks or extra fuel tanks in the wings, are often limited to use in level flight only because of the geometry of these tanks, or their fuel lines may cut off fuel flow at high pitch attitudes, steep banks, or high angles of attack. Fuel systems can become quite complicated, especially in older airplanes. Some engines have a fuel return system from the injection system, and it's not uncommon for the return fuel to go to the left wing main tank regardless of the fuel tank in use. That means you have to burn fuel from the left main first to make room for the return fuel without causing excess fuel to vent overboard. Return fuel sometimes amounts to as much as 10 gallons per hour more than the amount being burned by the engine, so other fuel tanks will empty much faster than their capacity and the indicated fuel burn rate suggests. Knowing these things requires careful study of the checklists and the limitations and system description section of the specific airplane's flight manual or pilot's operating handbook, and explaining it carefully and completely to your student. Some sources note that as much as 90% of all NTSB reported power losses in flight are not engine failures, they're failures in the pilot's fuel management strategy that cause a fuel tank to run dry or the airplane to run completely out of gas. Teaching your students how the specific airplane's fuel system works and strategies for managing and monitoring fuel in flight is the best thing you as an instructor can do to help them avoid engine failures. Air for combustion enters the engine through an inlet filter and then into the induction manifold. It's important to check the filter for obstructions or damage during your pre-flight inspection to ensure airflow to the engine. Many engines have an alternate air source to provide combustion air in the event of inlet filter becomes obstructed in flight. Alternate air may be manually selected or activate automatically, depending on the design of the specific engine and airplane. Alternate air is usually for emergency use only, since alternate air sources usually do not have a filter and therefore will permit dusty air, insects, and other contamination to enter the engine. Some designs have a manually selected ram air source that bypasses the air filter to provide a little extra boost from the relative wind. Ram air is limited to use well above the ground where you are less likely to encounter dusts or bugs. The cockpit throttle control moves a throttle plate in the induction system. The position of this plate determines how much induction air is sent to the cylinders for combustion. We talk about opening and closing the throttle. When the throttle is fully forward to wide open, the throttle plate aligns with the airflow and lets almost all of the air pass toward the cylinders. When the throttle is closed, the plate blocks the airflow almost completely. The amount of air sent to the cylinders is the main means of controlling the engine's power output. If the airplane has a manifold pressure gauge, the gauge measures the air pressure in the induction system as changed by the throttle position, and it is the primary means of indicating power selection. As long as the fuel flow is correct for the amount of air in the cylinders, we'll talk about mixture control shortly, the engine will develop power. In carbureted engines, carburetor heat is a form of alternate air. Carb heat takes hot air from the engine exhaust and emits it into the induction manifold ahead of the throttle plate. Carb heat is designed to prevent formation of ice on the throttle plate and to a lesser extent to melt ice off the throttle plate if it has already formed. Because heated exhaust air is less dense than cooler ambient air, when you apply carb heat, you're reducing the amount of air available for combustion. That's why the power drops when you apply carb heat in your pre-flight check. We'll cover the use of carb heat and the indications that result later in this program. The ignition system provides the spark that ignites the fuel air charge in the cylinders. Magnetos are mechanical devices attached to the engine accessory case. As they spin, they create short electrical pulses that travel down wires called the harness to the individual spark plugs in the cylinders. The timing of these sparks is set to follow a pattern that alternates between cylinders and occurs at a time in each cylinder's power stroke, so it ignites the fuel and air at the optimum time. Magnetos do not need the airplane's electrical system in order to generate spark. As long as the engine is turning, the magnetos fire the spark plugs. This is usually done with a battery-operated or pneumatic engine starter to get started, but it's also how some small engines can be propped by hand to get the ignition started. Each cylinder has two spark plugs for two reasons. The first is redundancy. Each cylinder can operate on a single spark plug. So if an individual spark plug fails or a magneto quits working, the engine will continue to operate. The second reason is to improve efficiency. When two plugs fire simultaneously, they create two flame fronts that rapidly burn the fuel air charge when the piston is completing its compression stroke. You know two plugs are more efficient than one because that's how you determine they are working during your before takeoff engine run-up. When you turn off one magneto and its connected spark plugs quit, the engine RPM drops. And when you turn the magnetos back to both, the RPM rises again. If the airplane has all cylinder monitoring, you can check the ignition system during engine run-up even more precisely. When you turn off one magneto, check that the exhaust gas temperature column remains illuminated for each cylinder. If one cylinder goes dark, that means the spark plug in that cylinder is not working. This may or may not cause engine roughness or an excessive RPM drop, so you might not see it otherwise. There's even another way to check the proper operation of the ignition during the magneto check. There's even another way to check the proper operation of the ignition during the magneto check. When you move from both magnetos to a single magneto position, all of the cylinders' exhaust gas temperatures will increase. Now, why would the temperature go up when the engine is less efficient? It's precisely that loss of efficiency that creates this indication. With only one spark plug firing in a cylinder, there is only one flame front as the fuel and air burn. It takes longer for all of the fuel and air to burn, and is not complete when the cylinder's exhaust valve opens. The fire is still burning as the exhaust passes the exhaust gas temperature probe, so it creates a false high reading on the panel gauge. There are some spark plug failures that only happen at high temperatures, so it's also a good operating practice to occasionally do a magneto check in flight at cruise power. This can help you find an impending ignition problem your student can take to his or her mechanic before it leads to delaying or canceling a flight. Magnetos have been used in airplane engines for over a century. They are a proven technology and are extremely reliable, but it's possible to get even more power or efficiency by varying the ignition timing for different phases of flight. Electronic ignition systems are now available as modifications to several types of engines. Most require retaining one traditional magneto for redundancy because electronic systems require the airplane's electrical system to be working, and you need a backup to keep the engine running if you have an alternator or battery problem. Some electronic systems need a magneto to start the engine too. Electronic ignition systems have unique operating procedures and tests that you'll need to find in the applicable Systems Pilot Operating Handbook supplement so you can teach them to your student. Your airplane's engine needs three things to develop power: fuel, air, and a source of ignition. Summing it up in this simple way will make it easier for you to teach what you need to do if an engine runs roughly, there is a partial loss of power, or if the engine quits completely. We'll cover teaching these procedures in a bit. To be ready to teach these concepts to your students, you'll need to spend time researching the systems and procedures that apply to the specific airplane you'll fly. Focus on the limitations and systems description sections of the Pilot's Operating Handbook or Airplane Flying Manual, in addition to normal and emergency procedures checklists. You can learn more by contacting the Type Club for the airplane type you'll teach. See www.eaa.org/typeclubs for a list of aircraft type clubs. Now let's see if we have any questions. I haven't seen any yet, have you?
No, not as they come in, but actually I have a question, a couple
Sure.
of questions for you there, Tom, because I've been taking copious notes here as we've been going through this. Can you explain a little bit more detail when we're talking about using the auxiliary fuel pump to cool the engine in a climb? Could you go a little bit more deeper on why that is?
Okay. Well, it depends on the type of fuel injection system. It is very type specific. So look at the checklist for the particular airplane you're flying. However, auxiliary fuel pumps in some designs will increase either the fuel pressure slightly or the pressure and the fuel flow rate to the cylinders. If in fact it does increase the pressure, that creates a greater differential between the vapor point and the current operating temperature in the engine compartment in a hot climb, and so that will cool things down slightly. If it increases fuel flow, then it retards combustion and cools things down even more. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that you mentioned was the tip tanks, which is great because when I'm doing transition training, it's one of the things I talk to my students about. And I will purposefully, when we go out and do maneuvers and things for a flight review or a phase of wings or something like that, I'll let them kind of cruise out, say, okay, let's cruise and we'll kind of level off. And then I'll go and say, let's do some maneuvers. And I would say probably 50% of the time, the guys are on the tip tanks first. And the reason is that I'm always given is that, well, I want to use the tip tanks first and then switch to my mains so that my center is closer to the center of pressure there. So is that something that you do as well, or do you have a different technique for that?
Well, it's extremely type specific. If it's a fuel injected airplane, in many cases, if you're burning fuel directly from the tip tanks into the engine, it may have some return fuel that sends that fuel to a different tank. Most of my experience with tip tanks comes in Beach Bonanzas, for instance. In tip tank equipped airplanes, the return fuel will go to the left main tank at the rate of about 10 gallons an hour. So that's probably an extreme case. But in that case, you have to make room in the left main tank for that return fuel. Otherwise, it'll just go out through the overpressure lines, through the vent lines. So what I like to do is burn the mains down a little bit, take off, climb, level off, burn the mains. And then when I've made some space in the main tanks, at that point, I can start running on the tip tanks. It is a good idea to try to burn the fuel out of the tip tanks before landing, because partially filled tanks in turbulence will slosh the airplane around and create some roll and yaw movement in turbulence coming back down to land. But it's a very type specific sort of situation.
Okay, and then finally, the last question I had for you was, I got this from one of my students. This was great. He said, well, I have a dead battery. I'm just going to go hand prop my airplane, and that's going to charge it. Could you tell why that's not true?
Well,
because I've heard this from more than one person, and I say, okay, the battery's completely dead. There's no voltage in it. Somebody left it on overnight. It's absolutely dead.
Yeah.
And it's hard sometimes for people to understand, why that is.
Well, a couple of situations there. In many cases, alternators are not self-exciting. In other words, you may not even be able to get the alternator to work by hand propping the engine. But in virtually all cases, a battery connects to the aircraft's electrical system through a battery master relay. And the relay itself requires some residual battery power in order to activate or close. So if the battery is completely dead, there may not be enough power to hook that battery into the electrical system. You might get the alternator working and be able to see electrical power in the airplane, but you won't be recharging the battery, and it'll be dead next time you land too. But more importantly, you no longer have any sort of emergency backup if you should have alternator failure in flight. From a technical standpoint, there is good reason not to try to do that. From a safety standpoint, virtually no one learns how to prop airplanes any longer. There was a fatal mishap just last month in Tennessee where someone attempted to do that in a Cessna 182, had incurred a head injury and died as a result. Further, a working electrical system is a required item for airworthiness in most airplanes that have an electrical system. So there's some legal issues there as well. But primarily, it's a safety issue in the fact that you might get the engine started, but you're not going to have the electrical power or electrical reserves that you think you have.
No, thank you very much, Tom.
Sure.
And everybody else, if you want to please, as the presentations are going, feel free to type those questions in. We'll accumulate them, and we'll have another break here in probably about 20 minutes where we can do some more questions. So please keep them coming. Tom, let's hear some more.
All right, we'll keep on going then. We'll take it up next and talk about mixture leaning. Leaning the mixture properly is vital to obtaining takeoff and climb power, and for desired economy and cruise. Leaning is usually taught only superficially in pilot training, however. No wonder pilots frequently have questions about leaning for high density altitude takeoff and climb, and why so many pilots run out of gas when the book says they should have had enough to make it to their destination. Let's look at the effect of mixture control on engine power and temperature control, and specific techniques for leaning the mixture for takeoff, climb, and cruise flight. There are four main references for mixture control. The most accurate indicator is exhaust gas temperature, or EGT. Turbocharged engines may have a turbine inlet temperature gauge that is an EGT located at the point the exhaust gas enters the turbo. Cylinder head temperature can also be used, and in fact, it was the primary mixture management tool in the piston airliner era. Many airplanes have fuel flow gauges to provide information to assist in mixture leaning. In airplanes with fixed pitch propellers and those that do not have the EGT or CHT gauges, Propeller RPM is used as a substitute. Now, to illustrate mixture control's effects, we'll use this chart from Continental Motors. The relationships are valid regardless of the engine type. You may have seen versions of this graph from other sources as well. The basic chart was originally developed by Lycoming in the 1930s, I believe. We'll read the chart based on the condition of the fuel-air ratio as noted at the bottom of the chart. Mixture settings to the right are richer, that is, more fuel per unit of air, while the mixture becomes progressively leaner as you move it to the left. As the mixture changes, there are corresponding and predictable changes in exhaust gas temperature, cylinder head temperature, power output, and specific fuel consumption. Each is plotted on the chart. We'll also cover how to detect these areas of engine operation if you do not have all of these engine instruments in the airplane you're using to teach. Exhaust gas temperature serves as the basis for all mixture management. At full rich, the EGT will be fairly low. As you lean the mixture, the EGT will rise until at some point it reaches a maximum or peak temperature. Continue to lean farther and the EGT drops. Mixture settings at higher fuel flows than peak EGT are called rich of peak or ROP operation, while settings with less fuel than the peak point are called lean of peak or LOP modes. Cylinder head temperature behaves similarly as you change mixture, with two interesting differences. First, the peak or maximum CHT occurs while still rich of peak EGT, about 40 degrees Fahrenheit rich of peak. Second, before reaching peak EGT, the CHT begins to drop, much more rapidly than it does at richer mixture settings. In fact, to obtain a CHT roughly 15 degrees Fahrenheit below peak CHT, you need to reduce fuel only slightly to reach peak EGT, but you must enrich in fuel flow nearly 4 times as much on the rich side of peak EGT, as noted by the red asterisks on the CHT curve. This is one reason many pilots like to fly lean of peak if it works for their engine and meets other goals. CHTs run cooler while burning less fuel. Power development is directly affected by mixture setting as well. Like EGT and CHT, the percentage of selected power increases as mixture is leaned away from full rich. Peak power development occurs at roughly 100 degrees Fahrenheit rich of peak EGT. Because the horsepower curve is pretty flat near its peak point, anything from about 75 Fahrenheit to 125 Fahrenheit rich of peak results in about the same power output. That's why some sources state peak horsepower occurs at 75 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit rich of peak. It attains maximum horsepower at the lowest fuel flow. Notice the power drops quickly even before you get to the peak exhaust gas temperature. Lean of peak EGT, even a small change in fuel at lean of peak EGTs, even a small change in fuel flow results in a big drop in power output. The peak horsepower setting is where RPM is greatest also. If you're using the engine tachometer as your leaning reference, you lean until RPM begins to drop, then enrich until it returns to its peak. That puts you at peak horsepower. The rapid drop in power provides a clue as to why many engines run roughly on the lean side of peak EGT. This chart assumes all cylinders reach their individual peak points at exactly the same time. One mixture setting puts all cylinders of your engine at precisely the same spot on their individual performance curves. The reality is that each cylinder is on its own schedule and will reach its individual peak at a different time. Rich of peak EGT, this is not as noticeable because the power output of each cylinder is roughly equal even when the cylinders are not at the same point. At settings leaner than maximum horsepower, however, and especially when lean of peak EGT, even a small difference between cylinders creates a big difference in power developed. Cylinders running at different power settings will create vibration and roughness that degrades performance and is noticeable in the cabin. Lastly, Specific fuel consumption is a measure of efficiency, the amount of fuel burned per unit of horsepower. At rich of peak fuel flows, as the name implies, fuel consumption is high. It's not as efficient, and the richer you get, the less efficient it becomes. Specific fuel consumption flattens out just lean of peak EGT and remains there until roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit lean of peak. From there, the specific consumption again rises. Combustion becomes less efficient even as power reduction drops. These relationships provide some general guidelines for mixture control. For best economy, sometimes called a go-far mode, and assuming the engine runs smoothly lean of peak, operate at about 10 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit lean of peak EGT if your engine will do so. Because you want all cylinders to be on the lean side of peak for this economy, you'll use the last cylinder to reach its individual peak EGT as the reference for this leaning. If instead you want best power, the go fast mode, set the fuel for 75 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit rich of peak EGT, using the first cylinder to peak as your leaning reference. Let's look more closely at the best economy setting. We choose best economy because the specific fuel consumption is low. As a result of this setting, only about 90% of our selected power is available. Because the engine is creating less power, it also creates less heat, and therefore the cylinder head temperatures are far below their maximum. This can be important for you to know when you teach in high-performance airplanes. By contrast, the best power mixture setting burns significantly more fuel, but it creates a lot more power, 10% more than best economy as a result. For a given combination of manifold pressure and RPM, a best power mixture usually results in several knots faster true airspeed than best economy. Because of the greater power output, the CHTs are higher at best power also, but this is tempered somewhat by the increase in cooling airflow that results from the faster indicated airspeed that results. Most airplane handbooks and manuals recommend operating somewhere between best power and best economy mixture settings as a compromise between the two. This is fine as long as the engine runs smoothly and the selected power setting is not so high the engine runs excessively hot. Remember how we usually teach leaning the mixture in primary training airplanes? Lean until the engine begins to run rough, then enrichen until it smooths out. Look at the chart and visualize where this occurs. Somewhere lean of peak horsepower, the engine will begin to run rough as the individual cylinder power development varies. When you enrichen back until the cylinders are all on the flat part of the horsepower curve, the engine smooths out. You're probably somewhere between peak EGT and the best power setting, even if you don't have the cockpit instrumentation to see it directly. Most student pilots have the luxury of ignoring mixture control for takeoff and climb. At low elevation airports, and when only climbing a few thousand feet above the ground, it's normal to put the mixture control in the full rich position for engine start and leave it there until leveling off in cruise, if they adjust the mixture even then. On a hot day, however, even fairly low elevation airports will have density altitudes above 4,000 feet or so, high enough you'll need to lean to get best power for takeoff. With you during training, or after your work is done with a pilot, there will come the day when your student will need to lean for maximum power for takeoff at a high density altitude, and continue to lean the mixture for maximum power during climb. How do you teach your students to do that? The objective is to obtain the maximum available power for takeoff, along with additional fuel flow as needed for temperature control. Almost all light plane engines are primarily air-cooled, but in high power, low speed conditions, it requires additional fuel flow to make up for lack of cooling air. The extra fuel does not liquid cool the engine per se, but it does retard combustion, reducing power slightly and therefore reducing CHTs. There's a narrow balance between having the proper mixture setting for takeoff and having too much or too little fuel, either of which means even less power is available for takeoff and climb. The takeoff fuel flow prescribed by most flight manuals results in a roughly 200-degree Fahrenheit rich of peak mixture setting. This equates to the factory maximum fuel flow at sea level, adjusted for an increase in altitude. This results in near maximum horsepower just before the point where richer mixtures cause power output to drop. CHTs will be well below peak as a result of fuel retarding combustion. Of course, the fuel consumption is high, but this is the cost of taking off. Some airplanes' fuel pressure or fuel flow gauges include target fuel flows for takeoff at various altitudes. This fuel flow will result in the recommended takeoff and climb mixture setting for that altitude. Advance the throttle to full, then lean the mixture until the indicated fuel flow matches the reference for the pressure altitude. Notice that each reference is a bracket or range of fuel flows. Use the high end of the appropriate altitude reference for takeoff. As you climb, periodically lean to keep the fuel flow within the range for your current altitude. If your engine has an exhaust gas temperature gauge, note its approximate reading when you have leaned for takeoff power using other techniques. You'll find that this temperature is consistent for most engines at takeoff manifold pressure and/or RPM, regardless of altitude. Once you know the target EGT for your engine, you can go to takeoff throttle and RPM and simply lean until the EGT reads this target value to get the correct mixture for takeoff. Occasionally lean the mixture more to keep the EGT at this target value as you climb. If you're using propeller speed as your leaning reference, go to full throttle and begin to lean the mixture. The RPM will probably increase at first as you get closer to the best power setting. Continue to lean until the RPM begins to drop, then enrichen until RPM peaks again. Enrichen a little bit more as long as the RPM does not again drop for that little extra fuel needed to assist in temperature control. After takeoff, and once you establish climb speed, when a fixed pitch propeller will usually reach a higher RPM, carefully lean again for maximum propeller speed. As you climb, occasionally lean the mixture further to keep the propeller at this maximum RPM. When should you set the mixture for density altitude takeoff? One technique is to pause momentarily after taking the runway for takeoff, advance the throttle to full, lean for takeoff power, then release the brakes and go. I prefer to have more time to set mixture properly and also spend less time in position on the runway, especially at non-towered airports. When doing the engine run-up then, I'll briefly go to full throttle and adjust the mixture for takeoff there. Then I leave the mixture control in that takeoff position when I reduce throttle at the end of my run-up and as I taxi into position. Now the mixture is in the right place for takeoff power when I return the throttle to full. Advance the power, quickly cross-check the cockpit indications for maximum power, and then release the brakes. Okay, now I see we've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to take the questions from the top and we'll see if I can get to them all here. First question, do you perform a magneto check before every flight, even if the previous was less than an hour ago? Seems to me that mag checks are tough on the engine. I certainly do. As a matter of fact, there are some things that you might be able to get away with as a first flight of the day before takeoff check item. I don't think that the magneto check is one of them. Some airplane types, Cessna 172s come to mind, the carbureted ones, tend to build up a lot of carbon on the spark plugs when taxied at a rich mixture setting on the ground. One of the reasons that I will do a magneto check before every takeoff is because the simple act of taxiing at reduced power settings can cause the spark plugs to get blocked up with carbon, and I might have less than full power available for that next takeoff. So personally, I do a magneto check before every takeoff.
Hey, Tom, one of the questions that would go right into that, Rich asks, can you please explain why running the engine at high RPM with a lean mixture will bring a dead or rough running cylinder back to life during run-up?
That's exactly what's going on there. If you go back, I'm not going to go back to the chart here, but if you visualize those charts again, as you lean the mixture, the cylinder temperature is going up. and the exhaust gas temperatures are going up. It's increasing the temperature in the engine compartment. And a cooler mixture setting, a richer mixture setting, might not have the heat to burn carbon off of the plugs. As you lean the mixture at a higher RPM and you lean the mixture, you're warming up the interior of the cylinder, and you can actually burn that carbon off the spark plug electrodes. Okay.
Another question. Yeah. Do you see one?
Go ahead.
I'll throw it to you. Okay. Do you teach engine management with students in the first ground lesson?
From a very basic standpoint, I make sure that they know that the function of the throttle is primarily to control the airflow. The function of the mixture is to adjust the fuel flow so that it matches the amount of air going into the engine. Later on in life, when I'm teaching in an airplane with a manifold pressure gauge, we use that as a primary reference. But then by that time, hopefully the student will know that the manifold pressure or the throttle position is only giving them the potential for power development. The fuel flow has to be right, and the ignition has to be working properly to actually get power out of the engine. So one of the first things I do is teach them the true function of the controls. It's different from what we're used to in a car, and it's not what you would naturally expect. I think what most students would naturally expect, that they're merely moving an air control. In airplanes with carburetor heat, I'll briefly describe what it's doing, and when we use it, I'll make sure that they have full understanding of that before they would solo the airplane. If it's a more complex airplane, it's been a very, very long time since I've done any primary training in anything other than very simple airplanes. If it's a much more complex airplane, yes, I'm going to spend a lot of time on the ground with them before I ever fly the airplane, so they understand the basics of engine operation and fuel management before they have to be able to act on that in the aircraft.
Okay, let's do two more real quick.
Okay.
One question was, what procedures or whatever do you teach so you don't shock cool the engine? And that's a thing common too. I've heard from instructors, I was up in this, turbo normalized Bonanza and I simulated an engine failure on this guy. And it makes me cringe sometimes when I hear stuff like that because clearly it's a lack of understanding of turbo normalized aircraft.
We could do a whole seminar on turbo normalization.
I'm sure we could, yeah.
We'll go there. But shock cooling has been essentially debunked as a direct hazard to our engines. When you think about it, when you shut down the engine at the end of a flight, that's going to experience more cooling air change in temperature there than at any other point. And if you had dissimilar cooling issues, you would also have dissimilar heating issues. So you'd have problems in the process of starting the engine and running to a higher throttle setting also. So I'm not terribly concerned about shock cooling per se. What I do want to make sure is that I have a smooth change in power settings so that I don't abruptly change the fuel air mixture and radically upset the balance that creates power. Further, in some engines, back to those turbo normalized Bonanzas, those bigger engines and things like that, they have some issues with what's called counterweight detuning. They have dynamic counterweights on the crankshaft, and making long, drawn-out power reduction glides at low power settings can actually cause vibration in the counterweights and cause a long-term vibration effect in the crankshaft. So there are lots of type-specific issues. From a more generic standpoint, make smooth power reductions. Smooth reductions are much more important than the actual amount of power reduction done. And just like we learned ourselves in our primary training, and we teach in primary training in simple airplanes, if you're going to be practicing power reductions, do it somewhere where you're within gliding range of an airport, just in case, and occasionally check the operation of the engine during your glide to ensure that you do in fact still have power being developed.
All right, and final one we have is if the EGT doesn't move at all when you try to lean it, what could be the possibility?
Well, an EGT has an exhaust gas temperature probe, and the probe itself is a thermocoupled device, which means it expands and contracts with changes in temperatures and converts that into an electrical signal that goes to the gauge in the cockpit, and they do fail. that's probably the most likely situation. Either the EGT probe itself has failed, or the wiring has a short in it, and you're simply not getting the indication you should in the cockpit.
And then one last thing here. Paul asked, how do you teach what manifold pressure is? And Paul, I'm going to direct you to an article that was written back in the late 90s, and it's called Manifold Pressure Sucks. Fantastic article. I think, Tom, you know exactly which one I'm talking about.
Yes.
And that's the go-to, at least for me, when I'm teaching about manifold pressure, because it's really not about the pressure, but it's about, how much it sucks, right?
Right. Yeah, manifold pressure is the air pressure in the induction manifold after it has been modified by the throttle. So it's whatever the air pressure is in that line. And as I said earlier, I teach manifold pressure not as what creates power, but it gives us the potential for power development if the other factors are correct. Also, the fuel flow is proper and you're getting good ignition. But manifold pressure is merely the air pressure in that system. And I ask pilots, if your airplane's in Denver and you have not yet started the engine, what would the manifold pressure be? And a lot of people say, well, it'd be 0. I haven't started the engine. I said, well, go look and think about it.
Look.
The reality is, go ahead.
It's ambient pressure.
It's the ambient pressure, which not adjusted to sea level. In other words, standard pressure at sea level is 29.92 inches, about 30 inches of manifold pressure. And the pressure lapse rate is about 1 inch per 1,000 foot of altitude. So at Denver, approximately 5,000 feet above sea level, you would have 5 inches of manifold pressure lost below that 30-inch sea level. You'd have about 25 inches on the ground. Regardless of whether the engine is running or not. So I use that as an exercise to have a student visualize that manifold pressure is the potential for power development, but not necessarily whether or not the engine is developing power.
All right, very good, Tom. Well, let's get to the last part of our presentation here, and then we'll take some final questions at the end.
All right, great. We're going to talk next about carburetors. Although most training aircraft fleets today have fuel-injected engines, the vast majority of light airplanes still have carbureted engines. If you instruct much, it's a good bet you'll eventually teach someone in a carbureted engine airplane. Especially if you've taught primarily or exclusively in fuel-injected airplanes, it's good to be briefly reviewing the hazard of carburetor ice, conditions that create carburetor ice formation, and then the somewhat unusual indications that occur when you first apply carburetor heat if carb ice is in fact present. A carburetor includes a venturi to draw air into the induction manifold and combine that fuel with air. When inlet air enters the venturi, 3 things happen. It speeds up. As a result, its pressure drops, which draws in the fuel. And as a consequence, the temperature in the induction air drops. The temperature drop may be as much as 70 degrees Fahrenheit or nearly 40 degrees Celsius. If the air is humid and the temperature drop puts the air at or below freezing, ice will form on the first thing the moist freezing air encounters, the throttle plate. Ice on the throttle blocks the passage of air to the cylinders. It has the same effect as closing the throttle. Engine power drops. Carb ice is most critical at low power settings because you've already partly closed off the airflow with the throttle, and the remaining passageways will more quickly close and bind up with ice. Warmer air can suspend more water vapor than cold, so warmer air is generally more moist. Because moisture is available, and because carburetor air temperature drops up to 70 degrees, carburetor ice can occur even in warm to hot outside air temperatures. The highest potential for carb ice is when temperatures are from about 20 degrees Fahrenheit and 7 below Celsius to as high as 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 C, with relative humidity greater than 80%. Colder than this range, and there is probably not enough moisture in the air to create ice. Carb ice is less likely, but it's still possible at lower relative humidity and temperatures as hot as 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 C. Carburetor heat is designed primarily to prevent the formation of carb ice. It has a more limited ability to remove carb ice that is already formed. When you apply carburetor heat, you are moving a valve that ducts hot exhaust gas into the induction manifold. Exhaust air is hot enough that carb ice will not form. But because hot air is less dense, it results in a power loss. Remember, that's how you check to see if it's working during the before takeoff engine run-up. Carb heat is less effective in removing ice that is already formed, in part because it may take a lot of heat to melt the ice, and in part because the ice may have already created enough of a power loss that there's not a lot of exhaust gas left to warm the induction system. Generally, you use carb heat as an all or nothing control. Pull it on fully when icing conditions are likely, and off when it's not needed. Some airplanes have carburetor temperature gauges. If the airplane you're teaching in is so equipped, and assuming it is calibrated properly, you can apply just enough carb heat to get the indicated temperature above freezing. This reduces the amount of power loss that results from using carburetor heat. Unless the pilot's operating handbook suggests otherwise, standard practice is to apply full carburetor heat as a preventive measure anytime you reduce power below about 2,000 RPM and when in the traffic pattern for landing. If the engine develops carburetor icing and runs roughly or power drops, and you apply carburetor heat to remove it, the indications might not be what you would expect. As soon as you apply carb heat and hot air enters the induction system, the engine will run even rougher and power will drop even more because of the effect of the less dense air. Your initial response might be to remove the carb heat, but that's the wrong thing to do. Be patient, because if carb heat is going to work, it's going to take time, and it'll get worse before it gets better. If carburetor heat is successful at melting away the ice, power will return, but it won't be as strong as it was before the carb ice formed, again, because now you're running on less dense air. However, you should keep the carb heat on to prevent ice from forming again. And because the amount of air in the engine has changed, you'll need to re-lean the mixture as well. This leads to our last topic for tonight, guidelines for dealing with engine roughness, partial power loss, or total engine failure. In any type of engine emergency, your first response should always be to simply fly the airplane. Maintain control, establish the appropriate speed, whether that be best glide in a single engine airplane, blue line in a twin, or some higher speed if the airplane still has enough power to maintain altitude at that higher airspeed. As soon as the airplane control is assured and you are at or trending toward the proper airspeed, aim the airplane somewhere that will result in the best possible outcome. Close to the ground, this probably means pushing the nose down to a landing attitude and then flaring for an off-airport landing. In a twin, you may be able to aim up if the single engine control and performance permits. In all cases, point the airplane in the direction of the most suitable landing available as a result of your altitude and the amount of power remaining. For purposes of this presentation, we'll assume the power emergency takes place at a high enough altitude that you have enough time to attempt an engine restart. Your first response to an engine problem then is to fly the airplane and then aim somewhere. Remember, as we discussed at the beginning of this program, for an engine to run, it has to have fuel and air in the right proportions and spark to ignite that fuel-air mixture. If an engine is running rough and it's the result of something you can fix from where you sit in the pilot or instructor seat, you can fix it by manipulating the fuel, the air, and the ignition controls. And guess what? Your response, the steps you need to take to restore engine power, are the same regardless of whether it's a rough running engine, a partial power loss, or a total engine failure. Always check against the emergency checklist for the specific airplane you're teaching. You'll probably find, however, that all engine roughness, power loss, and total engine failure checklists follow these same basic steps. There's only one procedure your student needs to memorize and practice. This helps you a lot as an instructor also. The same basic procedure applies to almost any airplane you fly. Engine restart consists of checking and adjusting the engine's fuel, air, and ignition systems. In a carbureted engine, your first step is to apply full carburetor heat. Carb ice is a common cause of engine roughness, partial power loss, and even total engine failure in carbureted engines. So carb heat stands the best chance of restoring lost power. You also do this first while you still have ample heat in the exhaust system to melt carb ice. Apply full carburetor heat, remembering that the engine will sound and work even worse at first and improve only after ice melts off the throttle. Next, verify the fuel is turned on. If so, most airplane manuals suggest switching to a different main fuel tank. Fuel starvation, that is, running a fuel tank dry while there is still fuel available in another tank, is a very common accident scenario. If that doesn't work and the airplane has an auxiliary fuel pump, turn it on consistent with that airplane's handbook instruction. Also, move the mixture control to full rich. Full rich might not be the most efficient place to run the engine, but the engine should run at least some in the full rich position. If none of that works, verify the magneto switches in the both position. If the engine is running roughly and nothing else has restored power, selecting one or the other magneto positions may fix the problem. You may have an ignition system problem that will permit the engine to run smoothly on one or the other mag position, but not both. Unless carburetor heat restores nearly full power and conditions don't recur, or switching fuel tanks restarts the engine and you have sufficient fuel in the new tank to get to your destination with adequate reserves, land the airplane as soon as possible and investigate to get the engine checked by a mechanic. In carbureted engines then, the procedure is simply fly the airplane, aim somewhere, then check air, fuel, and ignition. Next. Engine restart in fuel-injected engines also consists of checking and adjusting the engine's fuel, air, and ignition systems, but in a different order. Historically, engine failures in fuel-injected airplanes are most commonly caused by fuel issues. So start by selecting a different main fuel tank. If that doesn't restore power, turn on the auxiliary fuel pump consistent with the airplane's manual. Also, move the mixture control to full rich, except in turbocharged airplanes. A turbocharged or turbo-normalized engine delivers a lot of extra fuel to support its boosted manifold pressure. If the engine quits, the fuel pump may still be providing full fuel flow, which without turbo boost will flood the engine. In turbo engines then, pull the mixture to idle cutoff and then advance the mixture slowly to see if the power will get restored. If the engine relights, you can then advance the mixture further if the turbocharger resumes boosting the air, or leave the mixture where it supports combustion if the turbo doesn't return. Just like carbureted engines, if power is not restored or the engine continues to run rough, check that the magnetos are on both and then try the left and right position to see if smooth power returns. Lastly, activate an alternate air source. This is usually automatic in fuel-injected airplanes, which is why you can save it to be the last item on your engine restart checklist. In all cases, unless switching fuel tanks restores power and you have sufficient fuel in that tank to fly to your destination with adequate reserves, land the airplane and get it checked. So in fuel-injected engines, fly the airplane, aim somewhere, and then check fuel, ignition, and air. So regardless of your airplane type, if you experience a rough running engine, partial power loss, or engine total engine failure, fly the airplane under control toward an acceptable landing. Then as time permits, adjust the fuel, ignition, and air controls to try to get it running smoothly again. If you do these things and power does not return, there's nothing you can do from the pilot seat to get the engine running again. In that case, establish your best glide for landing in a single engine airplane, or feather the dead engine's propeller and transition to single engine flight in a twin. The order in which you do these steps varies by the engine type and equipment, and may be modified by the pilot's operating handbook or airplane flight manual for the specific aircraft. But if all you teach your students about engine restarts is fuel, ignition, and air, it will be easy for them to remember the restart attempt steps in virtually any airplane they'll ever fly. In this webinar, we've covered a lot of material. We've covered the reasons why flight instructors need to teach students on all levels about engines and engine management, what engines need to run and how they get what they need, leaning for takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, and some for arrival, including high density altitude conditions, using carburetor heat, including the unusual initial results of its use, and how to properly respond to engine roughness, partial power loss, and total engine failure. There's a lot more we instructors are responsible for teaching pilots about the operation of their engines, but this is a good overview of some of the most important items that are not routinely covered in pilot training. So we've got a number of questions here. Let's get to them. Let's see. Gene asked, I have one EGT. Okay, we already got that one. EGT strategy different for turbocharged engines. The only difference with turbocharged engines is that most turbocharged and turbo-normalized engines have a red line temperature for the turbo itself. It is actually a limiting temperature based on the rotational speed of the turbocharger's turbine and the materials strength at the temperatures that those speeds generate. So the only difference between leaning a turbocharged and a normally aspirated engine in cruising flight anyhow would be to lean the same way you would the normally aspirated airplane, except do not exceed that turbine inlet temperature red line. Now, turbo engines are actually easier to manage. The mixture is easier to manage for takeoff and climb than a normally aspirated airplane, because in most cases, you'll simply leave the mixture control in full rich for takeoff and all the way through climb. The manifold pressure is going to operate at maximum all the way up to something called critical altitude, which is usually 15,000 feet or higher. And if the manifold pressure is constant, you need a constant amount of fuel flow to maintain the mixture setting needed for combustion. So with a turbocharged engine, unless you have specific instructions otherwise in the handbook for that particular engine, a turbocharger usually is put to full rich for takeoff and left there until you lean for cruising flight. And then from there, you lean just like any other engine. Okay, Harry asks, I've flown with many pilots who claim they were taught carb heat is unnecessary in the Piper Cherokee series. I always teach them regardless. Have you ever heard of this? Actually, I have. I had a similar situation when I got my multi-engine ticket in Piper Apache. My instructor said, we never have to use that. And then one day we had what appeared to be a carburetor icing issue on one engine. And I said, you know, if you've been doing what most people do, we probably would have been able to prevent that. My personal feeling is that carburetor icing is more likely in some types of engines than in others, but it is a potential hazard in any sort of carbureted engine. And so at low power settings, I'm going to use the carburetor heat to prevent that.
And obviously use the recommended procedures in the pilot's operating handbook.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if it tells you not to use it, then don't use it, but otherwise go ahead and use it. And I've never seen one that says don't use the carburetor heat at low power settings in flight. Okay. Robert asked, what's the difference between turbocharged and turbo-normalized engines? A turbocharged engine increases the manifold pressure to some level above standard pressure. If you were at sea level and you went to full throttle, you would get something greater than the standard roughly 30 inches manifold pressure. Some turbos will boost as in general aviation airplanes will boost in the 36 to as much as 42 or 45 inches manifold pressure range or higher. Turbo normalized engines, by contrast, are designed merely to provide sea level manifold pressure up to high altitudes. So in a turbo normalized engine, you would put the throttle to full and you would only get the 30 inches of manifold pressure at full throttle typically. Now, there are various techniques that are used in the design of turbocharged versus turbo-normalized engines to give you detonation margins and other things. But the basic difference is that turbocharging gives you an increase in manifold pressure above natural levels. Turbo-normalization gives you sea level normal manifold pressure up to some high altitude limit. Dennis asks, if engine RPM has a red line value lower than what it achieves at full throttle, should you use the red line or full throttle on takeoff? If the RPM has a red line and you're exceeding that, I would follow the red line indication. However, I'll give you a caveat there that it's most likely a calibration issue on the tachometer itself. Ask a mechanic to do a quick check of the tachometer. There are portable strobe light devices they can set up on the glare shield of the airplane while the engine is turning. They can set it to read either a 2-blade or 3-bladed propeller. And with the engine running, it will give a very good, very, very accurate indication of the propeller speed. And then they can cross-check that against what the gauge in the cockpit reads. I've seen some airplanes where there is a sort of a mechanic's homemade placard that says for full power on takeoff, 2900 is correct, reads 2700 or something. The reality is that you probably need to get your tachometer fixed if that's the case. Until you have the opportunity to do that, I would go ahead and use the red line as a limiting factor. And I would cross-check the airplane's takeoff and glide performance against expectations from my handbook calculations. If the airplane's not getting the performance that it's supposed to for takeoff, abort the takeoff and take it back in and get it checked before you fly again. I suspect it'd be a tachometer calibration issue more than anything else.
Yeah, I seen that one time flying a 172, a climb prop was put on there. So when takeoff on normal angle of attack just after liftoff, it achieved higher RPM than possible. So that could be a circumstance possibly that I've seen personally, but yeah, it's very rare that I've ever seen that happen.
Yeah. Okay. That is a distinct possibility, however. That's all the questions that I see.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom.
Okay. Do you have anything else for me, Rick?
I don't. We've covered everything very well. I truly appreciate your guidance in this, and it's always exciting to have new topics. This isn't one that we've had before. So everyone, please, if you missed any of this, view it online, go to our website and check it out. But next month, let's go and please join us again on the Wednesday, and I think that's it for tonight. So with that, I'm Rick Todd, NAFI Board President. Thank you for joining us on Mentor Live.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Bob Mader again with a couple of quick reminders to help you get the most from this program. Earn credit for this course by clicking the button on the right side of your screen that says Earn Wings Credit. This will take you to the FAAsafety.gov site to review the course content and take the mastery quiz. Remember, your input helps NAFI provide better features and benefits. And completion of the course evaluation earns a chance to win a NAFI 50th anniversary shirt. If you want to watch this program again, or view any previous Metro Live program, or share these programs with your students or friends, just go to nafinet.org to get the links. On behalf of everyone at NAFI, thanks again for watching, and safe flying.